What's up builders, it's me, Jimbotron, back at you with another video. In today's video, we're going to be revisiting an infamously bad build. This is AP Reaper. Now, if you didn't know, AP Reaper received a buff this season in Stadium. Not to any of his powers or anything, however, he received the Dire Triggers ability, and this scales off of ability power. So we're going to be seeing if it's actually kind of valid now. Let's get into it. So originally, AP Reaper was a very bad build because although you'd output a lot of stats, it had two very large flaws. The first one was that after you teleported, you were locked into an animation and completely vulnerable to damage. If you were CC'd during this time, you were a free kill. However, you didn't even need any CC because you CC'd yourself and couldn't really move at all, so you were free kills to anyone outside of your range. The second was that, although your AP damage was good, this build really required you to get kills to keep cycling your cooldowns properly. Because of this, if you weren't getting kills with the AP Beyblade, you didn't have enough burst damage outside of it to get the kills otherwise, because you weren't building into any weapon power. However, now both of these problems are fixed. You can now cancel your Death Blossom if needed, and you can also use your Dire Triggers for additional burst. The two main weaknesses of AP Reaper are actually gone. An interesting tech that you can do with this build is by binding the cancel of your Death Blossom and your Dire Triggers to the same button. You can cancel and use the Dire Triggers in the same frame, which will allow you to do an extra 100 to 300 burst damage, depending on how many shells you can hit after using your teleport. This significantly improves the amount of kills you can get. Anyway guys, let's get into the powers. So as for powers, I want to make it clear that you can take these in any order really. However, there are some rules you should follow. I'll break them down for you as I go through them in the order that I take them personally. So my first power that I usually take is Wraith Renewal. This will restore 7% of your max life per second for the 3 seconds that you're in your Wraith form. This will double if you're below half health. If you use this properly, you can get up to 42% of your max life as healing, which is really nice. You generate cash and ult charge on this, so you'll find that this is probably one of the best early game powers for Reaper, considering he doesn't really have that many good powers. Most of his stuff is completely random, useless, or doesn't provide anything in any way, so this is probably our best pick here. Now, when I do this, I tend to take Spirited to Slay next, so this would make it so that securing a kill will reset your teleport and half of your Wraith form. I do like to do this second, as it makes it so that you can sustain a lot better and you have a lot more mobility. However, if you do this, you are putting off taking the main power of this build until round 6, which kind of sucks to be honest. I think you can take Spirited to Slay round 6 instead, and instead take the next power. The next power being Strangle Step. Now, one of the rules that I just wanted to mention is that you do not take the final power of this build that I'm about to show you after this until you have Strangle Step. This thing will make it so you teleport quicker, which is nice. You can get caught off guard a lot less, but it also makes it so that your lifesteal doubles when you teleport. Now, a lot of people think that means you have to run a stupid amount of lifesteal. It doesn't. Reaper already has 25% built-in lifesteal into his kit, which gets doubled by the new Strangle Step. You can have 50% lifesteal just after teleporting for basically free, and then this only gets complemented by taking more lifesteal anyway. Yeah, definitely need this before you take the final power. And the final power being Death Step. Now this is technically the main power of what AP Reaper is all about, and after you use your teleport, you get a mini Death Blossom. The reason that this has been so tricky is, as I mentioned, you usually get CC'd for all of the animation. However, they changed that recently, so you can cancel out of it. This will do a decent amount of damage around the area you teleport, and when you have Strangle Step, you'll also do a lot of sustain through that. If they don't have CC, then you should be fine to get this damage off. Additionally, as I showed you, you can cancel it into your Dire Triggers to get additional damage, because it sucks taking the power that the build revolves around on round 6, where half of your games won't even go. You can instead take Spirited to Slay here on the final round and just move Strangle Step and Death Step up a slot, which is probably the better thing to do. I just really enjoyed the Wraith Renewal and Spirited to Slay synergy. One thing that's worth noting, if you are just going for a pure Dire Triggers build, is that Dire Triggers actually activates the Backstabber power. However, because it's technically 2 shots, only half of the damage will be amplified, which is why it's not in this build. If you didn't want to take Death Step, you can very easily also take Backstabber. Now on to items, and unfortunately, here Reaper's items absolutely suck. For starters, Reaper only has 2 epics that you should even debate taking here. All the other ones are really just throw picks. The first one is Wreath of Ruin. So what this does is make it so that when you use Death Blossom, you move quicker and your radius is bigger. This will make your ults and mini ults significantly more efficient. The thing is, this isn't a good pickup until you have the mini ultimate, which isn't until around rounds 4 to 6 anyway. Once you get to that stage, it is definitely worth it. And aside from that, the only other one I take here is Onslaught, and honestly, I still really don't like that at all. So Onslaught will make it so every third shot you do will shoot 2 shotguns instead of 1, and the second shot does 80 damage. It's kind of like a 20% damage increase every third shot. There are some cool interactions with this that can buff it up. However, we aren't taking any of those in the build, so it's kind of awkward. 20% every third shot can kind of just be written out like 6.6% extra damage per shot, which is comparable to the compensator, the 1k weapon item, which is really bad. However, why would you take this? Well, this is kind of burst damage, which is nice, and also dire triggers count as a single shot technically. Using dire triggers, you can cycle it, which means you can do 3 double shots in the space of 4 shots if you do this correctly, which honestly looks cool. Aside from that, I don't think there's any benefit to it. So if we're only taking 2 at most of Reaper's personal items, and even those are questionable, what items are we actually using? Well, first understand that all of the characters that work best at melee range in Stadium have gimmicks that allow them to be there. Mei has a ton of self-sustain in this mode. Tracer has so much mobility. Vendetta has a lot of health on a block. Genji has a lot of movement in a block, and you're kind of just left with Wraith. A single ability on an 8-second cooldown, and if that doesn't work, then you're screwed. So let's get around this. You do want to be building survivability. I can't stress enough how important this is here. Reaper can very easily hit a lot of survivability if you build him correctly. But before that, we're going to go over some other damage items, because that's what you viewers like. So here, honestly, I've had most success with Hybrid. You can definitely go for some raw ability items if you literally only care about the dire triggers. But if you are actually trying to use this build competitively, stick with Hybrid items. Phantasmic Flux works really well on Reaper because it makes it so that your 20% inbuilt lifesteal becomes 40%, and you gain overhealth really quickly when you're at full health. On top of that, it has the hybrid stats we were literally just talking about. Another really strong hybrid pick is Jet Skates. I always run this if I'm running into Phantasmic Flux, as it'll make it so that those 10-10 hybrid stats turn into 20-20 hybrid stats. It also has 25 health, which is kind of useless, but it's nice to have. The dash is insane, as it allows you to engage or disengage when you don't have any of your other cooldowns left. An interesting one I do like to take here is Super Flexor. Now, shotguns have some weird interactions with this thing. For every instance of weapon damage that you do to someone, you'll gain a Super Flexor stack, which increases your ability power. However, when it comes to shotguns, each individual shell does not grant a stack. You will only get 1 stack per shot, but that's not the full story. Basically, in Stadium, for some reason, the damage calculation for your critical damage and non-critical damage are 2 separate calculations. So because of this, if you hit both a critical shell and a non-critical shell, you'll gain 2 Super Flexor stacks. This means that it's really easy to keep a lot of uptime on Super Flexor. And the final hybrid item that I'm going to talk about that is a hit or miss here is Vanadium Injection. This is the king of hybrid items. If you watch any of my videos, you know I take this in a lot of builds. However, mainly in weapon power builds. When you take this in ability builds, you're typically losing out on a lot of value because most ultimates scale with ability power. If you're building into a lot of it, then you'll lose the value that you can get on those. However, Reaper's ultimate is really easy to counter at first, and Vanadium Injection's value is just so undeniable. Putting all 4 of these items together can give you up to 40 weapon power, 10% attack speed, 55 ability power, 150 max life, 15% of both lifesteal stats, 10% move speed, 10% cooldown reduction, 10% attack speed. You can't really get value like that anywhere else. And finally, for some survival picks, so the number 1 survival pick I'm going to tell you to get is Rüstung von Wilhelm. On Reaper, because you have higher base HP, at an absolute minimum, this will give you 100 extra health, which is kind of insane. However, one thing that I will suggest here is you can take Codebreaker. Codebreaker is a weapon item. However, its effects do apply to both weapon and ability power. The armor reduction on your dire triggers is usually 50%. However, this makes it so that armor only reduces 25% of dire trigger damage, which is a significant upgrade. And finally, the ratings. I'll keep this quick because I know I've yapped a bit. For impact, I think in its matchups this is really strong, especially because of how much HP you have. But it doesn't have much carry potential. Even in games where I MVP'd, I didn't feel like I was actually carrying. I'm giving this a 7 out of 10, which is actually one of the lowest impact scores I've given. For early game, this build is really strong. Wraith healing is great, and you can 2 to 3 shot most people early, minus tanks. On top of that, you're generating money through lifesteal. I'll give this an 8 out of 10, but that's more because Reaper is strong early, not the build itself. For scaling, I do like it. You can build a lot of survivability, and hybrid stats feel really nice. But I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. Reaper struggles hard into armor, which forces you into Codebreaker, and Death Step falls off later on. The build really drops off after round 6, when everyone's fully built. For fun, I can't justify a 10 here. There's still a stigma around this build, and you're very vulnerable to CC. You spend most of the game tracking cooldowns and playing carefully, so I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. Overall, this build scores a 6.75 out of 10. Maybe without my bias against AP Reaper, it could be higher, but there's just nothing that stands out. The core powers, Spirited to Slay, Strangle Step, and Death Step, feel clunky to cycle, and you're relying on opponents making mistakes. Dire Triggers is nice, but you don't need full ability power to get value from it. That said, Reaper has definitely improved. He's gone from D tier to high C, maybe even low B. Most of the build's old weaknesses are gone, but he still needs a rework. Adding a new ability without supporting powers just feels incomplete. His item pool is also weak, with things like Harvest Fest and Silent as the Grave adding almost nothing. These could have easily been replaced with Dire Triggers focused powers. So yeah, maybe I revisit this if that ever happens. That's everything for today, builders. I hope you enjoyed. See you in the next video.